Turning the Tide, U.S. Intervention in Central America and the Struggle for Peace is a 1985 book by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. It is a detailed analysis of U.S. foreign policy in Central America during the 1980s, focusing on the Reagan administration's support for right-wing dictatorships and death squads in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. The book begins by tracing the history of U.S. intervention in Central America, from the Spanish-American War to the present day. Chomsky argues that U.S. policy in the region has been motivated by a desire to maintain control over Central America's resources and to prevent the spread of left-wing movements. The book then examines the Reagan administration's policies in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua in detail. Chomsky documents the U.S. government's support for death squads and other human rights abuses in these countries. He also shows how the U.S. government used its economic and military power to undermine the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Turning the Tide also analyzes the role of the U.S. media in shaping public opinion about Central America. Chomsky argues that the media have been largely complicit in the U.S. government's deception of the public about its policies in the region. He shows how the media have ignored or downplayed the human rights abuses committed by U.S.-backed forces, while giving extensive coverage to the Sandinistas' alleged abuses. Turning the Tide concludes by calling for a change in U.S. policy in Central America. Chomsky argues that the United States should end its support for right-wing dictatorships and death squads, and should instead work to promote democracy and social justice in the region. The book was a critical and commercial success, and it helped to raise awareness of U.S. intervention in Central America. It is considered to be one of Chomsky's most important works, and it remains a valuable resource for anyone who wants to understand the history of U.S. foreign policy in the region. Here are some additional details from the book. Chomsky argues that the Reagan administration's policies in Central America were a direct continuation of U.S. Cold War policy. He points to the fact that the administration's rhetoric about the region was often couched in Cold War terms, and that it sought to prevent the spread of communism in Central America. Chomsky also argues that the Reagan administration's policies were motivated by a desire to protect U.S. economic interests in the region. He points to the fact that the United States has a long history of intervening in Central America in order to protect its economic interests, and that the Reagan administration was no different. Chomsky documents the human rights abuses committed by U.S.-backed forces in Central America. He cites evidence of torture, disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. He also shows how the U.S. government turned a blind eye to these abuses. Chomsky analyzes the role of the U.S. media in shaping public opinion about Central America. He argues that the media have been largely complicit in the U.S. government's deception of the public about its policies in the region. He shows how the media have ignored or downplayed the human rights abuses committed by U.S.-backed forces, while giving extensive coverage to the Sandinistas' alleged abuses. Turning the Tide is a powerful and important book that provides a detailed analysis of U.S. intervention in Central America during the 1980s. It is a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the history of U.S. foreign policy in the region.